uncomfortable situation. The bell rang indicating the ending of first period as I watched her car disappear from the parking lot. With a deep sigh and a resolve I didn't even think myself capable of, I made my way to class. The doors began emptying as I started towards the quad with my head down. I looked up enough to make my way around, but no more. I couldn't see the stairs, but I could practically feel them as I made my way across the middle of the quad. I shoved my hands into my hoodie pockets and clenched my fists tightly. They were looking, and whispering, and sometimes even snickering. But they were still avoiding, granting me a careful distance as I passed, staring at the wet concrete with a red face. And then I felt it. Tingles. I smiled at the concrete and slowed my steps minutely, wondering if I should look up and go to him. I didn't need to. I felt an arm snake around my waist with the surging pulse of electricity. That was Edward as I halted my steps. My stiff posture immediately eased with his touch. I sighed, and finally lifted my head to the person at my side. Edward was standing beside me in his leather jacket, with his messy bronze hair blowing in the soft breeze of the morning. His piercing green eyes were boring into mine as I smiled, and leaned into his side cautiously, not knowing how close we could be. He smiled back at me crookedly, leaning down to place a soft kiss on my forehead. I smiled wider, turning my body into his chest, and closing my eyes, while his lips lingered momentarily on my skin. When he finally leaned back up, he made a pointed glance at the hood on my head. More like a glare really. I never could understand his grudge against it. Maybe he liked my hair, I didn't know. He seemed to sense my unwillingness to allow its removal because he didn't make any move to. He scrutinized my nose with pursed lips.
You heal pretty fucking quick.
He smirked, moving his free hand to cup my cheek lovingly. I chuckled and rolled my eyes. But my eye roll changed my field of vision momentarily enough for me to notice the people surrounding us. I let my gaze slowly wander over the expressions of the students, who were multitasking, as they walked and gaped at the vision of Edward cupping the crazy girl's cheek simultaneously. Edward's thumb began a soft caress of my cheek, relaxing me, while I turned my attention back to his green eyes. But he was glaring at the passers-by, a stark contrast to his loving caress. I sighed, gaining his attention, and smiled back at him. I'm kind of used to the whole staring thing by now. I shrugged honestly. It didn't mean I was comfortable being gaped at, but I had built a resistance to it somewhat. He sighed and drooped his hand, returning to my side and snaking his arm around my waist once again.
Come on, I'll walk you to class.
He smiled, leading me across the quad to the doors. I relaxed into his side as we traveled past all of the stairs and whispers. He tightened his grip on my waist as we entered the halls of the school, and the whispers were easier heard. I ignored them as I leaned my head against Edward's shoulder, letting his love and electricity ease me thoroughly. He stopped me at the door to my second period class, pulling me aside to the wall, and backing me up against it as he glanced around the halls nervously. He sighed, and placed one of his palms on the wall beside my head, leaning into me in an oddly protective stance.
Make me a promise.
He whispered, inches away from my face with his brows slightly furrowed in concern. I nodded without hesitation. He took another wary glance around the hall, before finally facing me again.
Wait for me at your desk after class.
He asked in hushed voice and an expression that suggested he intended the promise to be made after every class. I rolled my eyes. Edward, you can't possibly walk me to every class, I said rationally. As appealing as the idea was, it didn't make sense for him to take the extra time to cross campus and risk constant tardiness at my expense. He rolled his eyes back at me, leaning his face into mine further, and gazing into my eyes intensely. My breathing hitched a little as he came closer until his lips were barely resting on mine. Without my permission, my breathing began speeding up as he lightly took my bottom lip in between his, never breaking my gaze. I wanted to kiss him back, but the way his eyes were hypnotizing me as they bore into mine rendered me completely paralyzed. He released my bottom lip as he slowly smirked against it.
You just fucking watch me.
He whispered against my lips, raising his eyebrows, and leaning back with the same wry smile plastered on his face. I nodded. Quite profusely. He chuckled, and stepped aside, waving a hand towards the door, and watching as I walked inside. I took the new seat the teacher pointed out to me in the back of the class. When I looked back at the door, he was gone, but I still had a little grin. And when all the students filtered in, and began looking at me, all I could think about was seeing Edward in 1 hour.
Edward's point of view. I glared at all the people I passed as I made my way to my second period class. Bella was naive. She didn't understand how much power these people had over her. All it would take is one asshole who was too curious, and she'd be fucked. Nothing was stopping me from protecting her completely now. If I thought I could really get away with it, I'd just fucking transfer into all her classes and never leave her side. Of course, walking her to every class was as much excess as I could possibly get away with. So I do it. People were staring at me more, not that I really gave a shit. Usually that kind of attention would make me fucking restless and pissy. They'd get over it eventually, once the novelty of us were off. Once the bell rang for second period, I was the first motherfucker out of that door, and crossing the quad back to my girl. She was good, sitting in her seat and waiting for me just like I asked. She lifted her head when I appeared in the doorway, and smiled at me, picking up her bag and shuffling over to me. I really wanted to ask her to take that goddamn hood off, but I knew better. There were too many people here for her to do that. And I didn't want to make my girl uncomfortable, so I just put my arm back around her little waist and walked her to third period. She leaned into my side as we walked the halls, breathing in deeply on occasion, and smelling me. I was doing that shit a little too. Flowers and cookies. Fucking divine. I still fucking glared a little as I steered her around the people in the hall. They stared. I glared. I dropped her off at third period, with a soft kiss on the top of her head. She smiled up at me and walked into class, looking back at me as I made sure she got to her desk, without being fucked with. By the time third period was over, I was certain that everyone already knew. The whispers in the halls were a little fucking ridiculous. Nothing even remotely original. When I walked to her classroom door, I peeked inside, taking a moment to inspect her face carefully to make sure the whispers weren't getting to her, as she walked towards me. She was being quite the little champ about the whole thing. Still fucking holding her head down and leaning into my side, as we passed the people, but she was doing it. She probably had the chance to stay home today, avoid it for as long as fucking possible. But that's not how my girl worked. I was beginning to see that more and more every day. I walked us to the lunchroom after third period, pausing at the door with my arm around her waist, and furrowed my brows a little fucking uncertain. I didn't know where to sit with her. I eventually decided to take her to my table. If Brandon and Jazz wanted to sit with us, they could. And even though it would bug the shit out of me, if Rose and Emmett wanted to come and sit with us too, I'd keep my fucking mouth shut about it. She looked a little surprised at first when I led her to my table, but didn't object to my choice as I pulled a seat out for her. She smiled at the ground and sat in the seat timidly, taking her cookies out of her bag as I took my seat beside her. Then she did something I had never expected her to do on her own. She reached a hand up and slid her hood off, letting all her long brown hair free. I smiled pretty fucking widely at her, glad to have the hood gone, even though I was pretty sure she'd put it back up after lunch. It was still a big step. My girl was comfortable with me beside her. I chanced to glance around the lunchroom, where everyone was pretty fucking much still gawking. I rolled my eyes and scooted my chair closer to my girl, worried that they were making her uneasy. I slid my hand under her hair, cupping the back of her warm neck and caressing it softly with my thumb. She shivered and turned her head to me, blushing with a small smile. I snickered at the blush and kept stroking her neck as we ate our bag of fucking delicious cookies, in a silence that was far more comfortable than one would have expected, as we remained under the scrutinizing eye of the cafeteria. Brandon and Jazz walked in the room 10 minutes later, looking particularly fucking unkempt. Their hair was all over